Hi, this module is about food security. And what I mean by food security, I'm referring to the situation where all people at all times have social, economic, and physical access to food that is nutritious and safe and plentiful. So, food security has actually 4 dimensions. But before we go to those dimensions, let's spend a few moments on why food security is so important. And that's really because of nutrition. And when we think about the range of health problems with which nutrition plays a prominent role, there are impacts at every age group and across many of the different kinds of conditions that we'll be talking about in this course. So if we just took 2 examples of global problems, we can think about obesity as one extreme, and at the other extreme, undernutrition. And if I asked you from a global perspective, which one of these is responsible for more mortality, more premature mortality, you might be surprised to know that it's actually obesity. And more than half of the world's populations live in countries where obesity kills more people than undernutrition. That being said, there are 850 million people globally, largely in developing countries, that suffer from undernutrition or hunger. And that's 1 in 8. That's about 1 in 8. And if I asked you how many of those people are actually in South Asia, we could draw a pie chart. And let's just go ahead and represent the proportion that are in South Asia. And I'm going to color in this quarter, so we know it's 25% at least, but I'm going to actually color in another 10, and it's 35%. And that is higher proportion than was the South Asia proportion back in 1990. Let's unpack this and talk about what we mean exactly by undernutrition. And there's 2 components we should differentiate. One is macronutrients, and the other is micronutrients. And by macronutrients, I'm referring to the protein, carbohydrates, fats that we use for energy. Micronutrients, I'm referring to those very small amounts of vitamins and minerals and other substances that are very important for child development as well as other health issues, especially reproductive health in pregnant women. And those are, of course, vitamin A and zinc, especially for child health, as well as iodine and iron. The impact of macro deficiency or micro deficiency or both is really realized in people in terms of how severe are those deficiencies, how acute is their onset, what is the duration, and what is the susceptibility. And when we think about susceptibility, we know that children, adolescents, and pregnant women and women of reproductive age are most vulnerable. And in fact, if we were to just think of the premature mortality in children under 5 years old globally, about 45% of that mortality is either directly or indirectly related to undernutrition. If we think of, let's say, an example of a morbidity, we can think of anemia from iron deficiency in pregnant women. And in more than half the countries in South Asia, the rates of anemia in women of childbearing age exceed 50%. So these are just 2 examples. What if we wanted to step back and try to describe the health of a population? What would be the measures we would use? And interestingly, it would be 3 measures that are actually reflective of 3 different things we'd observe in children under the age of 5. And it turns out that this is a good barometer of the health of a whole population. nutrition-related health. So what are those 3 different factors? Well, the first is the under 5 prevalence of underweight. And by underweight, I mean thin for age. And I'll jot that down, thin for age. The second is the under 5 prevalence of wasting. And wasting, I'm talking about thin for height, and wasting reflects a more acute condition. So thin for height. And the third is the under 5 prevalence of stunting. And stunting is short for age. And stunting is actually felt to be one of the best indicators for overall undernutrition, and it's irreversible. So even when nutrition improves, it takes a while for the prevalence of stunting to decline. And we're going to see in South Asia that we have relatively high rates of all 3 of these indicators. So think about what those might be for a moment. And I'll share with you that the average of these, if we just take the cluster of countries in South Asia, for underweight is 32%. So 32% of children under the age of 5 on average are underweight, and about 15% of those are severe. In terms of wasting, about 16%. And in terms of stunting, an average of 38%. Again, that's 38%, nearly 4 in 10 children have irreversible stunting because of undernutrition. Well, if we thought about the variation between those individual countries of South Asia, what would we find? And what we would find if we just said, well, what is the worst performer? Which country actually has the worst values? And the answer would be, for underweight, India. For wasting, India. And for stunting, India second place, only to be beaten out by Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is the worst, followed by India. And to give you an example of how high those values would be, while the average of underweight is 32%, in India it's about 45%. And if I looked at the poorest states or the lowest wealth quintile in the poorest states, or I looked at the rural regions, these rates can exceed 60%. On the other hand, if we look at stunting, we see that same social gradient, where much higher rates than even 38% in the poorest quintile and some rural areas, and much lower rates, more favorable rates in wealthier states and in wealthier parts of different states. So this heterogeneity across countries and within countries is due to a myriad of circumstances, and this is a good moment as we begin to think about how to improve nutrition in South Asia to return to where we began, which is what are those 4 domains of what we're going to call food security, ensuring that situation where all people at all times have access to enough high quality and safe food. So those 4 dimensions are availability, access, the third is utilization, and the fourth is stability. And let's return and just define each of these. So what do I mean by food availability? I'm referring here to, is there an adequate supply of food? And is the type of food, the quality and diversity of that food sufficient? And if we think globally, availability on these 2 dimensions has improved. The countries in South Asia, a little bit less so, have received a little bit less of this benefit. And an example would be Bangladesh, where the majority of the population still gets most of their energy from cereals. Let's go to the second one. What do I mean by access? So access, we're really thinking about two different kinds of access. The first is economic. And what I mean by economic access is, do families and communities have disposable income to be able to purchase their food? So when we see that in poor regions of the countries of South Asia, 75 and 80% of the income to a household is being spent on food, they are a vulnerable household. So economic access might also mean, is there a social safety net for those families that cannot afford food? The other kind of access is physical. And by physical access, I'm referring to infrastructure, adequate roads, adequate communication, such that that food supply, that supply chain is intact to get food to people. So if we just consider, for example, Nepal and the mountainous regions where there's very poor road density network, this is a challenge in particular. Now let's go to the third dimension, which is utilization. By utilization, it's referring to the circumstances that even if you have that food available to you and you have access to the food, you're unable to utilize it to maintain health. So an example would be, if we look at a population and we see underweight and wasting and stunting, but there's available food, we know that there's an issue with utilization. And you sometimes see this with children with repeated episodes of infectious disease. Another domain of utilization is the circumstances with which you prepare food. So do you have clean water? Do you have a place where sanitation is separate from the area that you prepare your food? All of those circumstances or social determinants are also important to whether we can utilize the food to maintain our health. And the final dimension, stability, actually has kind of two components. One is, I'm referring to the stability of the food supply. So when we think of a country that is subject to droughts or uneven weather patterns, as are many of the countries in South Asia, this is a challenge in terms of stable food supply. The other dimension of stability is actually food price. And the stability of food prices at the global level has an impact, not directly at the household level, but through a series of ripple effects that happen when countries react to changes in global prices. And we can also think in this domain about those global forces. So the interaction of population growth with shocks, such as those extreme weather events that happen because of climate change or are worsening because of climate change, and other types of natural disasters that really challenge the stability of food supply. And if countries are vulnerable and don't have adequate storage and safety nets, this becomes a very big problem. You're going to hear in the next module Professor Khanna talk about a particular dimension of food security that will heavily weight on these last two attributes.